So welcome back, guys. We're in our new studio. We're not finished with our setup just yet. We're almost there. But today we're going to be covering an episode about the hidden costs of purchasing property. Welcome to the Property Corner with myself, Rowan Alexander. This title is something that generates quite a bit of excitement. You know, people want to know what are the costs we should be looking out for. And very often we hear people say that they didn't know about certain costs. In reality, all of these costs are actually pretty transparent and should be communicated to you pretty clearly when you're purchasing a property. They might seem hidden to someone who is inexperienced or never bought a property before. But if you have bought a property, you would probably recognize most of these costs as having incurred them before. And maybe there's one or two that you haven't incurred before that I can just remind you about today. The first cost that is probably the most controversial is the one of transfer costs. Why is this controversial? Because the transfer cost is the total cost of transferring the property from the existing owner's name into your name. It's made up of a number of subcategories. Your transfer fees, which is actually the attorney attending to the transfer, their costs. There's the transfer duty, which is the portion which is payable to SARS. That's the taxation. Then there's the deeds office fees, the postage and petties. One of the spaces where transfer fees or transfer costs are very often ill understood is when people are buying a new property, especially new developments. And it's almost assumed that whenever you buy a new property, there should be no transfer costs. And this is exactly where the misunderstanding comes in. If you buy in a new development and the seller is a VAT vendor, you are exempt as the buyer from paying transfer duty. Now remember, transfer duty is only one of the costs in the total transfer cost. Transfer duty is the portion that's payable in tax in the form of transfer duty to SARS. So when you're buying a new property, the only costs, if you're buying from a VAT vendor, is the transfer duty that you don't need to pay. You would still be required to pay the attorney fee, the deeds office fees, the postage and petties, the electronic deed search fees. Those things can still all be billed. However, you wouldn't have to pay the transfer duty. Now, in some instances, developers opt to include the cost of transfer as well into their purchase price, where you are still paying for it. You're just simply paying for it in the form of the purchase price rather than getting a separate invoice for it. And there is no standard across the board as to how that needs to be handled. Some developers include the transfer costs, others don't. And this is where it's important to understand what agreement you are entering into, as to not be caught off guard by costs that you are going to have to pay. So transfer costs, that's probably the one that's the most understood. And I hope this breakdown helps you understand that a little bit better. Just remember, buying new, no transfer duty doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to pay the rest of the transfer fees. That's going to be dependent upon your particular agreement. But there will always be some form of a cost to execute the transfer, whether that's paid by the buyer or included by the developer as part of the sale. On second-hand sales, there will always be transfer duty unless the seller is a VAT vendor. Very seldomly the case, but in traditional purchasing, there should always be transfer duty involved. Transfer costs have a direct relation to the value of the property. So most attorneys, as well as my business, Alexander Swart Property Group, you can hop onto the website and have a look. There'll be a transfer cost calculator showing you the breakdown of all of the costs involved with transferring the property from one owner's name into the next. This episode is sponsored by BusyBuy. BusyBuy is an internet service provider that services households as well as businesses. BusyBuy have been looking after my personal internet as well as our business internet for nearly 15 years. BusyBuy are not just a standard internet service provider. They offer a lot more than that. Whether you're looking for simple internet connectivity, services such as hosting of email accounts through the Google platforms, or complete voice-over IP solutions for your business, BusyBuy is that one-stop solution for all your personal and business connectivity requirements. In a world where we are so dependent upon technology and connectivity, downtime is of the utmost importance, and this is where BusyBuy really sets themselves apart. With no call centers and a dedicated account manager and technician to your business, it really sets their business apart. BusyBuy also offers connectivity solutions for big events. So the next time you're out at a big event, have a look for the BusyBuy flags and the BusyBuy cars. They're probably there during the internet for that show. So to learn more about their services, hop over to busybuy.com and go and check out what they have to offer. So thank you to BusyBuy for supporting our channel and being a sponsor of this episode. So the second cost is the bond registration cost. Now, this will only be applicable if you're going to be making use of bond finance to acquire the property. If you're fortunate enough to be a cash purchaser and you're not going to be making use of a mortgage bond, then you wouldn't have the bond registration cost. Or if you are like most and you have to actually borrow that money from the bank, there's going to be a cost in registering that bond against the property. So that you're registering the interest that the bank has, the security that they have against your title deed. For that, you're going to need to employ an attorney. The attorney would typically be instructed by the bank to execute that work, and you would have to cover the cost. Again, this is a cost that is sometimes included in new development sales, where the developer may have a particular arrangement with the transferring attorney, whereby if they do the transfer and the bond registration, there's some form of a discount to the client, or the cost is covered in full by the developer. I think a big reason why sometimes people assume that those costs should be included or not, again, remember that would be dependent upon your particular agreement as to whether that cost is for your account or included in the developer's costs. In traditional second-hand transactions, that cost would always be for the buyer. As with transfer costs, the bond registration cost is directly linked to the value of your property. As the value of the property that's transferred increases, or the bond value increases, the costs of actually registering and executing such work is also higher. The third cost is a mortgage bond initiation fee. This is a once-off administration fee that the bank charges to process and to go through the process of raising the fees on your mortgage loan. If you are familiar with any sort of commercial loans that aren't residential loans, these are often invoiced or costed as a raising fee. In the property space, it's referred to as a bond initiation fee. It should be about 6,000 Rand once off upfront cost, and the banks will allow you to either add this to your mortgage bond or pay it upfront. As with the bond registration costs, this fee will only be charged if you actually make use of mortgage finance. If you're not going to be using finance to purchase your property, then you won't incur this cost. The last direct cost that I want to cover is the cost of occupational interest, sometimes referred to as occupational rental. Well, this won't always be a cost. It's one that's very often overlooked. Occupational rent is payable if you take occupation of the property prior to it transferring into your name. In some instances, it just becomes impossible to coordinate the registration of the property and the move-in date at the same time, and they may be two separate dates. From the day that you move in up until the date of registration, you will be liable to pay the previous owner for the benefit of actually occupying that property early. This then actually brings about the first thing that I believe is actually a hidden cost. And hidden in the sense that I don't think it's well understood by industry, and I also don't think it's well understood by clients, is that if you read your agreements of sale, occupation clause very often places the responsibility of maintenance and a certain portion of the risk and reward onto the new purchaser at the time of taking occupation of the property. In the commercial space, very, very often beneficial occupation is granted to a tenant or a purchaser prior to registration, and they almost take over the full risk and reward of ownership. In the residential space, that's not as common, but certain costs may actually be transferred, and certain requirements may, or certain provisions may actually be in that agreement to say that as the purchaser taking early occupation, maintenance and things like that may become for your account, which traditionally would stay for the account of the seller up until transfer. Be careful to understand that occupational interest or occupational rental clause very well. Read through it, make sure you understand it, should you actually opt to execute that, because people very often think that this is a mini lease agreement, where the traditional rules of a lease agreement would apply. But in actual fact, that's not the case. Occupational rental is something completely different to traditional rental, and it is dealt with in terms of a deed of sale, not in terms of the lease. So be sure that you understand those provisions, because they could raise costs which you didn't necessarily plan for. One such cost is very often that upon taking occupation, the purchaser may become liable for the levies. Paying for the levies. They could become liable for paying the municipal account. Now, in a traditional lease agreement setup, those costs would be covered by the landlord, and the tenant would only have to pay for his consumption charges. But typically in an occupational rental agreement, those costs would transfer to the new owner, to the purchaser who's taken early occupation. Then moving across to some of the more indirect costs. Now, I've recently moved home. The studio that we're actually sitting in is set up in my new home. And so I can attest quite clearly to these unforeseen costs, or not, not unforeseen, but rather indirect costs of moving. And these are simple things like the actual cost of moving. I think just on boxes, in the old days, we used to be able to get boxes from stores, and, you'd go around to your local stores and they'd give you some boxes and you'd move. Nowadays, that's become a lot harder as people are recycling, being reimbursed for boxes. A lot of companies actually moving away from boxes to crate systems. You very often need to go and buy boxes. I mean, I probably spent 2,000 or 3,000 Rand just on different packing systems to be able to move my house. Repairs and maintenance. So whether that be moving out of your old home where you rented or owned, you might have to paint some walls. You might have to, clean the garden and clean the house for the last time. Those costs are very often overlooked and not thought about. And the same way you're moving in, there could be costs. While your initial inspections might not have revealed certain costs, upon moving in, you may want to clean again. You may want to do some maintenance that you never picked up on upon viewing the property. There will generally be things like that. I mean, even me that's in the industry that trades every day, there was some maintenance issues that I needed to resolve the moment I moved in. Doesn't mean that I was sold a lemon or that someone didn't explain the situation to me about the house that I was purchasing. It was things that I would do differently as the owner, with different preferences and different risk appetite. So there's certain things that I wanted to do from a maintenance perspective or repairs perspective that the previous owner didn't weigh heavily on them for the same reason. So it's not because they didn't disclose things, it's because I have a different appetite. Security, something that's very often overlooked. You find yourself being comfortable in a home, whether you are secure or not, you find yourself being comfortable. Moving to a new home, there's a lot of different sounds and sort of movements in the suburbs and in the areas, and very often that would raise concerns about security, and you'll end up spending money on upgrading alarm systems or burglar bars or getting dogs for security, whatever the case may be. But often something that's overlooked. People see an alarm and they think they're going to be comfortable. Once they've moved in, they spend money on additional security measures. And then the last thing that's indirect and also overlooked is utilities. So water and electricity, all consumption related things. So things like changing electrical light bulbs from a older style bulb to maybe a modern LED, changing certain plumbing fixtures to things that are more water efficient or that are more modernized into a standard that you may potentially be used to. I mean, I've recently had this where I moved from a home that was completely independent of the electrical grid. I had a solar PV system registered with the City of Cape Town, and I had a minimal electrical bill. Moving to my new home, I don't have the luxury of having that PV system, something that I still need to do. So in the interim, I have that additional costs of the monthly costs of electricity, the water. I had a borehole, I don't have a borehole. The increased costs of having those things. Yes, I will ultimately install all of those at my new property, but in the meantime, those are things that over the years I have gotten away from the monthly costs, but moving, they've been reintroduced into my life. And not just that, you become used to, I'm using myself as the example because I've literally just done this, but I've become, sort of used to a certain standard and way that we operate and live and prefer to live. So, upgrading these utility type things, whether it be water, electrical, appliances, things that we maybe take for granted in the way that we operate, move into a new place and they're frustrating or whatever, and you can't afford to do them all at once, but you do start doing them. I've spent some money and had some unforeseen costs in my sewage system. I've moved into a very leafy suburb that is with big trees and a well-established garden. And while this is beautiful and we love living like this, it has maintenance costs too, because all my underground piping has been exposed to roots, sort of going into that system. Had to have all of them cleared out and cleaned up. Now, these are things that I didn't budget for as a purchaser, but at the same time, I understand that it's part of the being a homeowner, and it's part of the luxury of living in an established suburb with a big garden and big trees and stuff around us. So again, I think hidden costs is a very sort of clickbaity title, and it's something that is used a lot by the media to almost gain that interest and get you excited. But I think it also does a lot of damage, because it almost makes it seem as if there should be some level of mistrust, and that there should be something that you should look out for and catch, that someone's trying to catch you out. Hidden costs is probably not the right term. I can understand that if you don't know what to look for, if you don't know what you don't know, they can feel like they're hidden. But in reality, it's part of the education process. So if you're watching this video and you have been educated, then this would never be hidden to you, and you should be aware of them and come back to this video if you want to understand what these costs will be. And your broker assisting you in the process would probably also have covered all of these costs for you. But a simple search online will help you find. There's nothing new here. There's nothing sort of innovative. These are costs that have been around forever, and you should not be caught out being ill prepared for them. So I hope this episode has been useful. If you are a prospective purchaser, or if you're thinking about buying again and you just wanted a refresher, I hope this has helped and will prepare you better for the costs of ownership.